Nice.
Yes, thank you for punching the recording. I would have forgotten that. We are recording the meeting for those who can't be with us live.
All right. And so there we go. So some of you may be moderators, some of you may be clerks, but want to know why the moderator does what the moderator does. And some of you may at times find yourself assigned as moderators, even if you're clerks, and that can happen. The Book of Order tells us that the moderator possesses the authority necessary for preserving order. And I need to minimize here. For conducting efficiently the business of the body. So in the Book of Order, normally moderators are, the pastors of a church are normally assigned as the moderators. However, there can be exceptions to that. Excuse me, David, hang on a minute. I'm in a meeting right now, I can't talk. Sorry about that. Anyway, so moderators normally are the pastors of churches, but at times others can be assigned. If there is not a pastor of the church, usually the commission or committee on ministry assigns a moderator to that congregation. Sometimes moderators who cannot be present may assign the clerk to moderate particular meetings or someone else. When the moderator is the pastor, sometimes there can be a conflict between those two roles, as the moderators are expected to represent the Presbyterian Church as they fulfill their moderatorial duties by ensuring that the Book of Order requirements are met. However, sometimes meeting those requirements may not be cannot always be seen as pastoral. And so the moderator sometimes has to, understand the requirements of the Book of Order, at the same time find a way to be pastoral. And this can be particularly challenging at times. Why is this not advancing? Here we go. When moderating a meeting, meetings are convened and adjourned in accordance with the council's own actions. In other words, there should always be a call to order, and there should always be a meeting motion to adjourn. All meetings are opened and closed with prayer. Now, often it's appropriate to include some sort of a brief scripture reading or something, or a reflection as part of the opening that usually precedes the prayer. And this is true whether it's a committee or a session. Particular prayer requests can be solicited from those in attendance. Maybe something is happening in their lives and they feel like if the body would pray for that particular circumstance, then that can be helpful for them as part of the meeting. Opening prayers may include praise for God, thanksgiving for God's activity, invocation for the presence of God's Spirit, as well as particular requests. And the closing prayer may include thanksgiving for God's presence, for the presence of God's Spirit, and blessing God. All meetings are conducted in accordance with the most recent edition of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, unless the Book of Order has other guidance on particular items. So, and TJ is going to talk in more detail about the agenda, but in general, it should be, if it's for the session, should be developed in consultation with the clerk. If it's for a committee, then maybe you work with somebody there. An agenda should always ensure that a quorum is present. It should have a docket or an agenda that is presented as a draft, and then an opportunity presented for including new items of business. And it should also include reports from committees or entities that are accountable to the session, such as the trustees and the deacons. Once the information is incorporated into the agenda, then there should be a motion to adopt that agenda. And once that happens, then that defines what takes place in that particular meeting. Then the next item on the agenda should be a report from the clerk. Usually that is an opportunity to present the minutes of the previous meetings for approval. The clerk of session would report any changes in roles and report any correspondence that may require action. Now that action may be taken up under other business or new business. There's a tendency for elders, I have found, to, as soon as you have correspondence suggesting an action, they immediately want to address it then. And so the moderator should make certain that it's dealt with at the appropriate time in the meeting and not use the correspondence time to do that, simply to report that there is correspondence. An agenda should include a report from a treasurer or financial secretary, which includes a summary of income and expenses and so forth. And an important thing is a finance report should always only be received, not approved. You can't approve a finance report because you don't know if it's really accurate. You only know if it's accurate after there's been a financial review or an audit. So only the results of a financial review or audit may actually be approved. And then other items that you might want to include in the agenda. In the Book of Order, it lists three basic areas that a council is responsible for. And so each meeting of a session in particular should explore these areas. What's happening in the spiritual life of the congregation? What's happening in the worship life of the congregation? What's happening in the educational life of the congregation? What's happening in the ministry missional life of the congregation? And these, I think, respond to the Book of Order specific that the session is responsible for how the Word of God is being preached and heard, how the sacraments are being rightly administered, and how the covenant community of disciples is being nurtured. The agenda, of course, should include any committee or entity reports, and particularly those that require action for a council. And then the agenda should include other new business that may not come out of committee reports. An important thing in parliamentary procedure is that once an item of business has been moved and seconded, that item now belongs to the council. There is no such thing as a friendly amendment because whomever made the amendment, once it's been seconded, doesn't own it anymore. The agenda should also then include old business, any items carried over from previous meetings. And my recommendation is that you sort of the agenda should keep a running list of items that have been brought up but maybe never finally resolved so that you don't lose track of them over time, because that can happen. So if you follow Robert's Rules of Order pretty strictly, the way business should be done is someone moves something, someone seconds it, and then you discuss it. You allow pros and cons, and then once all the discussion is over, and all discussion, by the way, should always be addressed to the moderator, not to the people making the motions or seconding them. And once that discussion is completed or there doesn't seem to be any more, then it's time to vote. The simplest way of doing that is simply asking if there are any objections to voting. If you hear none, then fine, go ahead and vote. A more formal way, and this can happen, sometimes people like to hear themselves speak and keep talking and talking, and someone finally is tired of hearing it all, and so then they can call the question. That's a formal way. It's not a debatable motion, but it does require approval before you can actually move on the question itself. Once you vote on the question itself, the majority determines the outcome. The moderator only votes to break a tie. In my experience, when the vote is that close, often it is appropriate for the moderator actually to vote no, simply because that way the item of business can sort of be brought up again, and you won't have this, you're less likely to incur this antagonistic attitude. Well, the moderator made it happen, and so it allows the moderator to keep moderating in essence. Now, if you can strictly use Robert's rules, but the Book of Order does provide that councils may also make use of processes of discernment in their deliberations prior to a vote, as agreed upon by the body. And this is, in my experience, the far more common way, particularly when you have smaller groups or smaller congregations, smaller councils, when everyone generally gets along. An item comes up, it gets discussed pretty thoroughly, and when everyone seems to have reached the end of the discussion and there's a consensus, then someone moves it, it gets seconded and approved, or even at that point, the moderator can simply ask if there's any objection to it. And if there's not, then the moderator simply states, so ordered. And that's perfectly sufficient. So if an item on the agenda cannot be finally acted on at a meeting, it should be either referred to a committee or should be referred to a subsequent meeting. One of the most common things that I hear, and irritates me to no end, is someone moves to table a motion. According to Robert's Rules of Order, tabling a motion simply allows it to be taken up at a later time in the meeting. If a motion is tabled and is not addressed at a later time in the meeting, then the motion is lost and must be introduced as new business. So if an item cannot be resolved at a meeting, you need to either refer it to a future meeting or to a committee for more refining. Once everything on the docket has been addressed, the moderator should seek a motion to adjourn. Since the agenda was adopted at the beginning, no further business can be added or dealt with without the consent of the body. Now, it might be that someone has been going through the meeting and suddenly remembers something vitally important that somehow they forgot to bring up, and so they could make a motion to add that to the agenda after the fact. That motion would have to be approved by the majority before you could deal with it. But if that happens, then that does allow for people to bring up items of business that may not have been included in the original agenda. So that includes my presentation, and I will turn it over to TJ. Let me stop share. There we go.
Thanks very much, Pete. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and get this slideshow started. So this is building an agenda for mission. So some of you may be on session and function as committee chairs in your congregation, or maybe you've been commissioned to moderate a session, or maybe you're a pastor and moderating session. What I want to talk about right now is just the most important decision in advance of the meeting is, what is the agenda going to look like? And when will we discuss the most important issues, and how will we make sure that we have enough time to deliberate as we try to discern God's will for God's church? And so Um, I want to talk a little bit about this and hopefully help you as you look forward to making agendas for meetings that you're leading, to make sure that you make the most of that time that you have together. So just your goal is to create an agenda that focuses the discussion on the mission of your group. Um, so you want to be focused on mission, hopefully, and not on making sure there's enough commas in a document that you've developed, or to make sure that every little detail of something is correct. But you want to use this limited time that you have together to deliberate and discern together on how to better accomplish the mission of your church or of your committee or whatever kind of group that you are moderating. So some issues to consider. What is the most important item to discuss at this meeting? Or what is the big thing? So as you're preparing for your meeting, usually there's one or two items that you know discussing together in order for this meeting to be effective. And you want to think about where you want to place those items so that people are alert and ready to talk and not overly tired when that comes up in the meeting. So that's the first question that I always try to ask is, what is the big thing that we want to talk about during this meeting? And even if you're involved in planning a presbytery meeting at your presbytery council or cabinet or whatever you call that group, that should be a question that you're talking about together as you plan presbytery meetings. What's the big thing? What's the most important thing that we're going to discuss? And it's certainly something that we do at the presbyteries that I serve, and I imagine at most presbyteries, is we try to figure out how to maximize the time together by thinking about what's most important. The next question, what can be reported in writing and cut from the agenda? Because people are often volunteers and maybe have worked all day, or if they're retired, probably done some kind of work all day, as most retired people that I know do. You want to ask, what can we cut from the agenda? What can we just use? What can we just read on our own and not necessarily talk about? You don't need to discuss every report that comes into your session or to your committee. And sometimes it's sufficient for you to just receive something in writing and just be happy to have that information, file it away somewhere, or whatever you have to do with it. But if there's no action to be taken and there's no reason to discuss it, a lot of times you can just cut something out of the agenda and just receive the report in writing. Another question that is very important, when does this group typically run out of energy? It's usually 1 to 1.5 hours for our session at our congregation. Is that when people come to meet our session, we start at 7 o'clock in the evening. By 8:15, I can predict most people are half asleep. So you need to pay attention to that as you plan your agenda. When should we put the most important items? Well, you should do it when people are not out of energy quite yet. I know in my past congregation, we met after our session, met after worship on Sundays. And I know that when that happened, I was out of energy from the beginning of it. So that was even more challenging and can be more challenging if you do it that way. But when do people run out of energy? And then which actions can be handled in an omnibus motion or a consent agenda? And that's a list of motions that get approved without discussion at the beginning of the meeting. And so these are the issues to consider as you start to put your agenda together for your committee or your session or whatever kind of group you're working with. So I've got an example here of some items that might come in for a session meeting on a typical month or maybe once a year. So you've got your clerk's report, which you'll approve the minutes. You've got correspondence to report, membership totals, the kind of things that clerks report, treasurer's report, P&L sheet, other financial reports. Treasurer might answer some questions. The budget review and approval for the next year. The pastor's report, and let's say the pastor has got a request for some vacation time, proposal for updating the church website. Personnel committee report is submitted in writing. There's no action needed. Property committee, proposal to repair the leaky roof. And then the deacon's report. The funeral last week went well, was well attended, and there was a nice celebration of Mr. Smith's life or whatever. And so you've got all these reports that come in, and you're looking at the agenda. And again, you're asking, okay, what is the thing that we need to spend the most time talking about? What are those one or two things? What can just be looked at in writing? And what maybe should go at the end of the meeting? And how do we maximize the time that we have together? If it's a session and you're thinking, now I know there are sessions that meet for 3 hours. I personally do not do that, but it may work well in your congregation, and that's totally fine. But I'm thinking we want to do all of this in about an hour and a half, hopefully less. How do we do this efficiently? And I'll show you what I would do for our congregation, and it may be different for yours. But if I were to look at all of this and what's the most important thing to discuss to focus our time together on our mission, I would first have the consent agenda or omnibus motion. And with these, anyone can request that one of these items be removed and then discussed later in the agenda. But I would probably say approval of minutes from the last meeting can go on the omnibus. Pastor's vacation request. Most pastors know when it's good to take time off. That's probably not going to be something worth spending much time on. And then maybe the pastor's proposal for updating the church website. Maybe that's something you do every 2 or 3 years, and it's really not much to discuss. And so you put these things on the omnibus motion and you get them approved, and you're done with these 3 things in really less than a minute. And so then you can move on to whatever's next in your agenda. You look at what's submitted in writing. For me, for this situation, I would probably say we don't really need to hear the personnel report verbally. We've got a good written report. Maybe the clerk's report in writing is sufficient. And maybe the deacon's report about Mr. Smith's funeral. Maybe we don't need to discuss that unless there was a problem or something that we need to make a decision on. But it looks like it's just a report about a good funeral, and there's no reason to talk anymore about it. And so then I would put the agenda together like this: open with prayer. We'd have our consent agenda. Notice I put 7:05, and then the next item is 7:05 because that should take less than a minute. Budget review and approval. If it in a lot of circumstances in our church and maybe in your church, the budget review is something that's going to need some time, and people are going to want some time to talk about that. And if we put it at the end of the meeting, everyone's going to be too tired. So I'm just going to put that right up front. After people have settled in for a minute or two, we'll talk about the budget and go over any line items that people are concerned about. And I left 20 minutes for that. But really, in the way that I set up this agenda, if it goes longer than 20 minutes, it's really fine. We can take as much time as we need for that. And the next thing I would put on there is the property committee's report on the roof repair proposal. Most churches I know have a really strong property committee. And because of that, they're probably going to show up with a good proposal. But even still, it probably makes some sense to talk about it, especially if it's a major expenditure, about what needs to be done. Especially keep in mind that others on the session need to be informed about what's happening in the building in case you have property committee members rolling off of session, or you want to maintain that institutional memory. So I would take some time to talk about that. Pastor's report in this case, pretty short, 10 minutes. Treasurer's report, seeing as we just discussed the budget for 20 minutes or half an hour, probably isn't going to take very long. But I left 15 minutes just in case. And then at 8:10, toward the end of the meeting, are there any questions on our written reports? And this can give people an opportunity to ask questions about the personnel report or other things that were in writing. And then ask for new business and close with prayer. And there you go, session meeting in an hour and 15 minutes, maybe. And that's kind of how we think about putting together an agenda so that we focus on our mission, and so that we make sure that people have enough energy to talk about the most important things. And so we're kind of careful about where we time all of these things. And that's all I've got for mine. And I think we're going to go into breakout groups, and David's going to introduce those breakout groups.
Thanks, TJ. And thank you to Pete too for walking us through moderating. So we wanted to be a little bit interactive today. I think all of us have a sense that 99% of the time when we're serving on a session, votes are unanimous, or we have, consensus. There's kind of an obvious way to move forward, even if there may be some details that we need to talk through. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we happen upon some decisions that we need to make as a group that are a little bit thornier. And so as a way of kind of getting into how do we wrestle with these, we wanted to divide everybody up into groups and just focus on the question of talk about a time in your experience, whether it was at a committee meeting or a session, or it could even be somewhere outside the church. But most of us have most of our experience within church bodies. But some kind of group that was having trouble making a decision, and how you went about working through that difficult subject. And was it successful? Was it not successful? What are some of the things that you've learned from dealing with those kind of difficult decisions? So I'm going to divide everyone into breakout rooms at this point. There should be enough so that there's like 4 people. So why don't we take let's take about 10 minutes to just give everybody a chance to go around, take a couple of minutes to, introduce yourself and talk about a situation that came up for you. And then we'll come back together and hear about what are some of the difficult decisions that folks have wrestled with and maybe some lessons learned. So let's see. All right. You should have an invitation to join breakout rooms, and just go ahead and accept that. I think that's most everybody out. I see one person still.
So David and Joan, do you need help getting into your breakout room?
Should all be back. Good. Welcome back, everyone. Hope these were some fruitful conversations. What I'd like to do is now to have a little time of sharing to hear what you talked about in your group. What are some of the difficult situations that you've had to deal with, and what has worked and what hasn't worked? We're going to ask folks to, if you can use the raise hand feature. If you, I'm connected on a computer. If I look at the bottom, I have kind of a row of buttons down there, and there's one that says reactions. And if you click on, it has a little happy face with a plus. And if you click on that, one of the buttons that pops up says raise hand. And if you would like to get my attention to share something, go ahead and hit that, and that'll you'll pop up at the top of my list. Yes, W. Thomas Pye.
Just a word, if you haven't updated your Zoom in quite some time, the raise hand feature is still under the participants list.
Okay, good. Yeah, so if you don't see reactions, click on participants and you can find it there. Thanks. Anyone? Must have been very scandalous.
Like a good Donna from Newcastle.
Great, Donna. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm willing to contribute. Our conversations were very pertinent to exactly what we're all going through right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to do with the difficult decision of doing Zoom meetings and maintaining those Zoom meetings for our sessions and our committees, and what is lost in those conversations sometimes. What is possibly gained by participation of individuals who may not have participated in the past for all kinds of reasons. So there's a gamut of reasoning behind why Zoom meetings are fruitful versus Zoom meetings that are causing challenges for those who have computer challenges, whether it's just getting the equipment, obtaining the internet connectivity, or even the prowess of how to use the technology, which is sometimes, which creates barriers. So we had a lengthy conversation, and it became quite apparent. I mean, even given the locale of where each of us are from, there are inequities as far as those who are the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah.
And in some areas, it might not be experienced there are not very many have-nots, and in some other areas there are many. And that became very apparent to me in our conversation. So sometimes it's very challenging to be open to the thought that it may not seem apparent to you and in your area that it's viable. There are viable reasons to be able to use the technology, where in some other areas it isn't, and sometimes it's not as obvious.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you as an individual may not even see that disparity.
Yes.
So it's a continued opening of the eyes.
Yeah. As you worked through that as a church, did folks start to open up to other people's experience, or sometimes these conversations can kind of come back and revolve around, what's preferable to me or what's convenient to me. But I guess how did that conversation unfold? Did it move to that maybe deeper level of, okay, I didn't see it that way?
I don't know that we had the opportunity. I don't know if anyone in our group is willing to share a little bit about how you felt about that possibly.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Anyone else? What kinds of things are you dealing with? Let's see. I do see a hand up. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, our group, we had quite a variety of situations that people talked about. So, but I think kind of a common thread, if I can try to draw one out of it, was just the need for knowledge and listening. That sometimes you just don't know enough, and you need to find the people who know. And when, especially when you're in a situation where there's more controversy going on, what you need to do is learn from people you may think you disagree with. So there was I think a pretty strong thread there on at least a couple of our cases that said that's really powerful. So prayer and listening.
Yes. Yeah. What else? Other issues and other strategies? Nancy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm part of Donna's Presbytery, and we moved a lot toward using YouTube to publish our services. We initially just had the people in the room who were singing or the pastor, but we have moved on to having more people in the actual sanctuary. We started out by putting green tape out and letting people know they could only come in with masks.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a couple things that came out about this. One, we learned that there were people that were not members of the congregation that were watching us on YouTube and were very favorably impressed. So we're hoping they're going to come to meetings in person now.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing we learned is we had a lot of people who didn't have the technology to get into YouTube. So we thought, well, maybe we can bring it to them. So we loaded some of the services onto Kindles and took it to the people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that worked with a few people, but we found that there were still many people who, if they really didn't have the technology to get into YouTube, they really didn't have the technology to use the Kindle either, unfortunately. But it was an experiment. We tried it to see if it would work. So, you know, we were trying different things.
Yeah. Anyone else? What have you wrestled with, whether successfully or not? Well, David, if you are, Robert, did you had something to share? Oh, you're still muted.
We as a congregation have had the same concerns as Donna and Nancy, how to use the technology, and we've used the technology successfully. When we open the church, July the 18th will be our first service, and we're still debating whether you use the hybrid version or you go to the old way you used to have service. And I think we're gonna still have a hybrid service, and we're still struggling with that.
Yep. Yeah. That's our church as well. We have a number of folks that are have just become a regular part of the worshiping community, but are in other states, and so we don't want to leave them behind when we come back to worshiping in person. So the critical piece has been how, and that's the value that we've pursued. And so with that being the paramount value, you know, we want to continue to be one congregation. That kind of drives the decisions. Okay, so we put off the in-person services for a few more weeks so that we can get the technological pieces up and running and get there together. Yeah. Others? Well, thank you for engaging with each other and for sharing some of the things that you've been wrestling with. David now is going to tell us the right answer for how to deal with all of these tricky things. And so I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about how to lead groups through these discerning conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. I wish I had moderating through discernment and these 3 easy steps. Follow these steps and you're guaranteed to discern well. But discernment, as you all just were thinking through, related to COVID and the adaptations that we needed to walk through. Discernment was a very active process, I think, for the last 15, 16 months of our lives together as a church. but I wanted, it's hard not to focus on COVID and have COVID be the main topic of our discernment, but we've been forced to do that. And sometimes discernment is not our choice. We are a situation is put before us, and we have to wrestle with it. And we have to work through significant disagreements that arise in the midst of this. I think it's probably safe to say that decisions of the session, from whatever direction they're coming from, have been questioned more in the last during this time than maybe a lot of regular decisions that are being made. But I wanted to take a moment just to explore briefly how we create space for that healthy dialogue and decision making, whether it's a session, a committee, or a board that you're part of. This is really where I think it gets complicated, and where our fears step in at times. Am I able to moderate well and to walk through a difficult conversation? Our biggest fear is that the conversation will blow up and we'll have something that gets out of our control. But I think that with some careful thought ahead of time in our planning and how we work through it, we can come out in a good place. I wanted to just offer a couple guiding statements. These are phrases that came into my mind that I've heard many times as I hear people reflect on serving on the session. We spent 2 hours discussing what to do, and we left with no actionable steps forward. How many of you have ever been part of a situation where you have talked and talked and talked, and then you think maybe there's consensus and there isn't, and you just run out of steam and there's no decision made? That's often the case. Sometimes that's appropriate because maybe you weren't ready to. Another one that I have witnessed and experienced is, we thought our decision as a session or as a committee would get more buy-in from the congregation, and yet they just kind of didn't buy in. What did we do wrong? And then you get sometimes people who maybe were in the minority in a decision that was made. They might have not been in favor of something, but the majority were. It says, I knew that idea wasn't going to work from the moment it was proposed. I, for one, voted against it, which of course, as elders serving on the session, that is not an appropriate way to be an elder. If you are in dissent, the motion, just as if I make a motion or you someone makes a motion, the decision becomes a decision of the body or a motion of the body. So the decision is the decision of the body. I think some people don't understand that, but it's a common outcome or common reality in churches that, well, I didn't vote for that, so I'm sorry it didn't work out. And those are, we want to avoid these and hearing any of these statements from our meetings. We can't avoid it completely, but we can I believe actively work with some good preparation and good work. So I always have to remind myself, I'm a thinker. I'm someone who likes to figure things out in my head. Sometimes I think about those things out loud. Oftentimes, I'm many steps ahead of where the group that needs to make the decision is, as far as thinking through the implications of an idea or a concept. But discernment is a process that takes time. It always takes time. And often I would say that there's the 3 P's of discernment, or when you're leading through discernment. One is planning. I mean, we talked about that. TJ presented some of the ways in which we structure an agenda, but this is specific to, say you have one big thing that you're going to talk about and spend the majority of your time on during a meeting. We have to remember that as moderators, we might have thought about where this could go. And we have to meet people where they are, not expect people to come to where we are. And so that takes careful planning and thinking about, how do you present an idea? How do you offer thoughts about it? And how do you structure your conversation? It takes a lot of patience. We have to step back and we have to build in time for discussion, and again, of things that maybe we've already thought about. And I sometimes find myself impatient with a group that just doesn't see things the way I want to see them. And as a moderator, our job is not to be pushing our agenda. It is to facilitate the conversation so that a faithful decision can happen. But as we're leading discussions, we have to recognize that we need to build in time for that discussion, and also recognize when it's no longer productive. Sometimes we have to step in and say, I think this conversation has reached its conclusion. We're not going to decide anything tonight, but this has been fruitful. Let's sit on this. And then perseverance. I think we always have to have a long view to think that maybe we're not going to get to a decision tonight, but what's the big picture? What's the destination we want to go and aim towards as a congregation, and how does this decision fit into that? So one of the things that we face whenever we're leading through discernment is, how do we interpret and how do we respond to what I call resistance, to people who may not be open into discussing or thinking through those things that we've brought to our attention. What's the source of the pushback? What's the real issue? Sometimes it's not the one at hand. Sometimes someone on a session or a board is upset about something completely different. And because they're upset about it, and they maybe haven't done a good job of voicing that, they resist or react in ways that aren't there. Sometimes it's not it's not you, it's not your ability to lead. It's something completely separate from that. Sometimes our greatest challenge is allowing really all voices to be heard, but not to let one voice or a small group of voices dominate or control. And I don't know if any of you have seen, I at one point in my preparation, I was going to have a little handout, and maybe we'll send it out to you later. But there are some great documents and resources that help sessions in particular set ground rules for how they engage with one another, and how they believe the best in one another, and how they speak to one another. And this it allows the next two arrow bullet points here to happen. And that is that when somebody is disagreeing, I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting where someone starts their statement, well, people are saying that this idea is not a good one, or elders make this assumption, or participants on a committee or on the session, they get this idea that being a representative structure means that they literally represent someone. We don't represent a subset of the church. I'm this age group, and I represent this age bracket, and so I have to vote for this age bracket. No, we represent the will of Christ when we are participating in a decision-making session. And so we insist on the use of I language, speaking for ourselves, our perspective as we have thought about and are considering the issue at hand, and to insist on that, and to call people out when they don't, and when they're trying to bring, say, another person's agenda, or use that as leverage to make their point stronger than someone else's. And so if there's disagreement, and sometimes we have to call people out, particularly when they attack someone else's motives, or say something that implies that the other person, either doesn't know, or is not a faithful person, or brings up other side issues. So I left a blank one in here because I'm always thinking of new ones. So maybe I'll think of a new one while I'm listing these here. But Pete already mentioned this, but one of the things when there is an issue, your role as a moderator is to facilitate the conversation. And I hadn't thought about it, Pete, that way, that if you are forced to vote as a moderator, it is most appropriate to vote no, which allows for that to be brought back, late at a later time, but not to move something forward because you're making a choice. and settling a dispute amongst the leadership. I've had a lot of success in learning about and utilizing shared decision-making models where you don't use, some people think that if the session makes a decision, everyone should fall in line. Well, when you collaborate and bring people into the decision-making process, sometimes the session needs to engage with a larger group and have a workshop, have a forum, have a congregational conversation around a topic, and involve a larger group in the visioning work or decision-making piece. And that's something that maybe we can share in a future time, but there are models that are out there that you can follow. I think that one of the key pieces to effective discernment is that the group agrees to engage deeply with one another. And what I mean by that is that they respect one another, they listen to one another. And if you've ever heard this phrase, I like to include it in covenants with how we treat one another in a group, is that we agree to listen with the intent to understand, not to refute. I mean, how many times when you're in a situation where you're maybe disagreeing with someone and you're listening to them spout off their reasons for why they think this thing is the way it should be, and in my mind, all I'm doing is thinking about what am I going to say to just plummet them and make my point and let my view be dominant. And we want to be listening with an intent to understand, not to refute. I think that is a key principle, and that's what engaging deeply looks like, is to say, I'm going to respect you as a person, as a child of God, as someone called to the office in which you serve, and I'm going to listen and engage. And I believe also engaging in honest prayer with one another. Sometimes I've seen prayer used manipulatively. And so where someone, who it feels like they're losing their argument, or it's not getting enough attention, and I've seen it become spiritualized in the sense that, well, we just need to pray about this. That's not what I mean. I mean engaging in prayer that says, God, help us. We're at an impasse. We love you. We're trying hard to love you, to love each other. Help us in this moment to discern your path and be open to your wisdom and your will. And I think there are prayer can be a very effective tool, but we'd have to be careful about it being used in a manipulative way. I say this as this is sort of a large view of a session or committee or board. I've decided, this is my current hypothesis, that there are 4 types of sessions, committees, boards, groups that are working together. There are groups that are too busy for creativity and innovation. So they're, putting out the same fires, or they're bogged down in the same minutia, so that when a creative or innovative idea comes to them, there's just no energy or space to even discuss it. And so it might get a little bit of traction, but it doesn't get a lot of attention. And so knowing that as you walk into a session is important. Then you have let's form a committee to discuss that. And sometimes it's very important to form a committee. But sometimes they do that instead of owning their leadership role. Some sessions try to push off their decision makings to another group. That way, if it doesn't work or it doesn't go the right way, well, we formed a committee and it just didn't work. Then there are sessions that always say yes. They're like, yes, that's a great idea. And let us know how it goes. Not engaged, not necessarily engaged. And then, this is the ideal, the group that just says when an idea is presented, tell us more, tell me more, being curious, being engaged with the ideas. being thoughtful and supportive no matter what. So when I think about discernment, and I think about, I'm going to stop the share here. I want to say just a couple more things. When I think about discernment, I think it's about, yes, we need to be prepared. We need to persevere, have patience, but be prayerful about going into it. But that there are always going to be disagreements, and there are times when we agree to disagree. But to get the body to your group that you are moderating, to get voices heard, to have a focus on respecting one another and the opinions and their thoughts, and getting people to engage with one another in deep listening and prayer and openness. It's not something that, like I said, it's not a 5-step process that if you do these 3 to 5 things, you will discern your way through it. But I hope that gives you a little bit of that big perspective on helping to move your session or board, that you have the opportunity, whether you've been able to plan for it or you're thrown into the lion's den unannounced. That sometimes happens too. But you all have as a moderator have great power, and it's power that you can use for good, especially when there's conflict. So I'm going to stop talking, and I think we were going to open it up for questions and for any further thoughts or ideas. If you want to bring up any specific things that any one of us has said and you're like, what was that all about? I think we'd be happy to unpack it a little further. Yeah, I think, is it Dave? One of several Daves.
Thank you for your presentation, David. I would just like to support your points by telling a story of what happened when I was moderator of a presbytery. It was at a time when the church was trying to figure out what to do about affectional preferences and all that kind of stuff. It was a conservative liberal divide. It was a deep, difficult situation, almost causing eventually a schism in the church. Our approach was to bring those who were advocates of one position or the other together and to pray. And in our case, we chose to read the Psalms and reflect on them. So at 6 a.m. on Wednesday mornings for over a year, the proponents of the opposing views met in a chapel, and we prayed and read the Psalms. In the end, we did not come to agreement, but we came to mutual respect and understanding. And it wasn't easy because it caused, well, I'll just say it wasn't easy for me because it caused me to question deeply my motivations, my upbringing, my vision for what the church should be.
Thank you, Dave. That's just a great example. I mean, and we've seen that. We've seen those discussions about tough topics and how they have caused division. But there's also been that fruit that does occur when there is that mutual respect and deep listening and prayer. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any others?
David, this
Oh,
is
yes.
Henny.
Hi, Henny.
I don't know why my name is Susie up there. It's happened again. I have no idea. But anyway, I was really interested in all the things that Pete had put up. and I would like to have them on, making motions and call to order and all that. So I could have that for myself, as a reference.
Mhm.
Is there a way that I can get a copy of all that to help me?
So-
I've only moderated
Yeah.
one section, so, and I think I missed a couple things.
There,
I
there,
know
there will be a follow-up email in the next couple of days, just so that everybody has the recording from this. There are some people that signed up that weren't able to be with us tonight. We can also attach the presentations that that you saw, and that way you'll have it as a resource.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, we can all easily PDF our slides, and we can include those with what comes out. Absolutely. Anyone else have a question, comment? Or have we reached that point, TJ, where the ability to pay attention has starting to wane, and we should listen to your advice and say, we've had enough for this evening, but great. Well, seeing no other, we're just grateful for an opportunity to gather, to come from various parts of the, well, I can't even say we're not in the center of the Northeast, but I still consider Newcastle sort of the Northeast. I guess you're kind of on the border. But Henny, who just spoke there, she might even be able to throw a stone and hit Canada from her house. So
Definitely.
yes.
Vermont.
Vermont, at least, yes, across the lake. Great. Well, we appreciate your being with us, and we will be continuing to design and incorporate further opportunities to interact and learn together. And we appreciate your attention, and thanks to David David Baer for hosting and keeping us all on check, and TJ and Pete for presenting, and we hope you all have a wonderful night. I'd love to just offer a brief prayer of sending if there are no objections. We don't need a motion though. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, thank you for gathering us together. Thank you for your calling to serve your church. Thank you for the opportunities you give us to lead, and if and when we have the opportunity to moderate, pray that you would bless us with wisdom and strength, and the ability to lead well and to guide and move forward the purposes of your church throughout this world and in the places where you have planted us. Be with us and bless us as we go from here. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. Take care, everyone.
Go in peace, friends.
In peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.